Chapter 4. Phoebe wasn't taking any chances with George. "I'm not letting you out of my sight," she announced after they'd finished breakfast. "I'm your guardian angel." "I didn't know angels wore spectacles," he said, tugging on one of Phoebe's curls. "The smart ones do," Phoebe said, grabbing George's arm. She offered him a lemon drop from the little silver tin she'd been carrying around since London. George made a face. He hated those old lady candies. George wanted to go find Marco and Enzo and hear more about Italy. He wanted to ride the elevators up and down. Hardly any other ship in the world had elevators. Better yet, he wanted to find Mr. Andrews, the ship's designer. When Mr. Andrews had stopped by their table at dinner the first night, George thought he was just another boring millionaire coming over to kiss Aunt Daisy's hand. But Mr. Andrews was different. "You built the Titanic," said George. Mr. Andrews smiled. "Not by myself. It took thousands of men to build her, but I did design her, that's true." He invited George and Phoebe to come with him to the first-class writing room. He unrolled the ship's blueprints across a long, polished table. It was like looking at the skeleton of a giant beast. "She's the biggest moving object ever built," Mr. Andrews explained. 11 stories tall, 45,000 tons of steel, and longer than 4 city blocks. "Our aunt says nothing bad can happen to this ship," Phoebe said. "People say it's unsinkable." "No ship is safer," Mr. Andrews said. "That is certainly true." "What if the Titanic was hit by a meteor?" said Phoebe, whose latest obsession was outer space. She was determined to see a shooting star before they docked in New York. Mr. Andrews didn't laugh or roll his eyes like Mr. Landers did when Phoebe asked her questions. "I hadn't planned on any meteors hitting the ship," Mr. Andrews said thoughtfully, "but I'd like to think she could take almost anything and still float." Phoebe seemed satisfied. "Are there any secret passages?" said George. Mr. Andrews studied his blueprints and then pointed to the boiler rooms. "There are escape ladders," he said. "They run up the starboard side of the ship, up 2 decks, through the stoker's quarters, and into their dining hall. I hear the crew likes using them instead of stairs." George could have stayed there all night. He asked a million questions, and Mr. Andrews answered every single one. "I was just like you when I was a boy," Mr. Andrews said, just before Aunt Daisy came to haul George off to bed. "One day, I predict you'll build a ship of your own." George knew that would never happen. He could barely get through a day at school, but he liked that Mr. Andrews said it, and he sure wanted to find those secret ladders. But Phoebe had different ideas. First, she dragged George to the first-class library so she could check out a book on Halley's Comet. Then she took him on a walk on the boat deck. He felt like a dog. "Strange," Phoebe said, looking at the lifeboats that hung just off the deck. "There are only 16 boats. That's not nearly enough for everyone." "The ship's unsinkable," George said. "So do we really need lifeboats at all?" Phoebe stared at the boats and shrugged. "I guess you're right," she said, and then she announced that it was time to see how many ladies were wearing hats with blue feathers. George groaned. This would be the most boring day of his life, but at least nobody was yelling at him.
Hi, it's Elise, and I'm going to be reading chapters 5 and 6 of I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic. Chapter 5. At dinner that night, Aunt Daisy raised her glass. "To George, no trouble for one entire day." They clinked their glasses together just as an old man stopped by their table. "Miss Key," the man said to Aunt Daisy, "I've been meaning to say hello." "Mr. Steed," Aunt Daisy said. "What a pleasure. This is George, my nephew, and Phoebe, my niece." Mr. Steed nodded hello. "So," Aunt Daisy said, "what brings you onto this magnificent ship?" "Oh, I couldn't miss it," he said. "I think all of society is on this ship. I hear there's even an Egyptian princess on board." "Really?" Aunt Daisy said. "I haven't met her." "Well, none of us have. She's traveling in the first-class baggage room." "Excuse me?" Aunt Daisy said. "The princess is more than 2,500 years old," Mr. Steed said. George's ears perked up. "I'm not sure I understand," Aunt Daisy said. "She's a mummy," Mr. Steed said. "A mummy?" Phoebe gasped. "That's right," Mr. Steed said. "From a tomb near Thebes. I understand she belongs to a man named Mr. Burroughs. People are saying he sold the coffin to the British Museum. Then he packed the princess herself in a wooden crate. Apparently he's bringing her back for his collection. Some say it's bad luck to take a mummy from its tomb." "I'm glad I'm not the superstitious type," Aunt Daisy said. Mr. Steed chuckled. "In any case, nothing can harm this ship, not even the curse of a mummy." Mr. Steed tipped his hat and said goodbye. "Mr. Steed is a very famous writer in England," Aunt Daisy said. "You never know who you'll meet on the Titanic." And then it hit George, the best idea ever. That mummy, he had to see it. Maybe this day wasn't so boring after all. Chapter 6. George didn't tell Phoebe or Aunt Daisy about his plan. He figured he'd head down to the first-class baggage room after they went to sleep. He'd find Mr. Burroughs' crate, pry it open, and take a quick peek at the mummy. He'd be back in bed and snoring away before anyone knew he was gone. It was almost 11:15 when Phoebe was finally asleep and the light was out under Aunt Daisy's door. George crept out of bed. He quickly got dressed and put his knife in his pocket. He'd need it for prying off the lid of the crate. And who knew? Maybe there was a live cobra in the box too. George could hope, couldn't he? George opened the door and peeked into the hallway. He wanted to avoid Henry, who seemed to have eyes in the back of his bright orange head. He wouldn't like George creeping around so late at night. But the hallway was quiet. There was no noise at all except for the quiet hum of the engines, rising up from the bottom of the ship. George loved that noise. It made him think of crickets in the woods at night. In fact, being out here all by himself reminded him of the nights at home, when he sneaked out into the woods while Papa and Phoebe were asleep. He'd head out when his mind was filled with restless thoughts, about why Papa was always mad at him, or why he didn't try harder in school, and of course Mama. Almost 3 years had passed since she died. George tried not to think about her too much, but some nights, when he closed his eyes, he'd remember her smile, or her smell when she hugged him close, like fresh grass and sweet flowers, and that song she'd sing to wake George up in the morning. Awake, awake, it's now daybreak, but don't forget your dreams. Thinking about Mama was like standing close to a fire, warm at first, but get too close and it hurt too much. Much better to stay clear of those thoughts. Nothing cleared George's mind quicker than being in the woods. He never stayed out for more than an hour or two, except for that night back in October. George was heading back home when he heard a terrible sound, like a little girl screaming. He turned around, and in the dark distance, he saw 2 glowing yellow eyes. Some old-timers said there were black panthers in the woods, but George never believed it. But as the yellow eyes got closer, George could see the outline of a huge cat with 2 glistening fangs. George told himself not to run. He knew he'd never outrun the panther. But he couldn't help it. He ran as fast as he could. Branches cut his face, but he didn't slow down. Any second, the panther would leap up and tackle George. Its claws would tear him apart. George could feel the cat right behind him. He could smell its breath, like rotting meat. George grabbed a fallen branch. He turned and waved it in front of him. The panther lunged and grabbed the branch in its jaws. George let go of the stick and scrambled up the tree, climbing as high as he could go. The cat dropped the branch and came after him, like a shadow with glowing eyes. George pulled out his knife. He waited until the cat's front paws were on the small branch just below him, and then, with all his might, he chopped at the branch with his knife. Crack! The branch broke free. The giant cat tumbled through the air, screaming and crashing through the branches, and then hit the ground with a thud. There was silence. And then the cat stood up. It looked at George for a long moment, and it turned and walked slowly back into the woods. George stayed in the tree until it was just about light and made it into bed just before Papa woke up. His friends at school refused to believe George when he told them, even when he swore in his heart. No way! Big fat lie. Next thing you'll be saying is that you've been signed by the giants. Their laughter rose up around George, but it didn't bother him, because right then he realized that it didn't matter what they thought. George knew he'd face down the panther, and he'd never forget it.
Hi guys, it's Grace, and I will be reading Chapter 7 of I Survived the Sinking of the Titanic. Just thinking about seeing the mummy made George happy. He went down 5 flights of stairs to G deck and practically skipped along the long hallway toward the front of the ship. He ducked into doorways a few times to hide from the night stewards. But he had no trouble finding his way, not like Phoebe, who got lost walking from the dining room to the washroom. Next time I'll leave a trail of breadcrumbs. Like Hansel and Gretel, she said, their first day aboard. How about lemon drops? George had suggested. Phoebe had giggled. The hold was in very front of the ship, past the mail sorting room and the cabins where the stokers and the firemen stayed. Too bad, George thought, that there wasn't time to sneak in and see the escape ladders. Luckily, there were 2 more days at sea. George walked right through the doors of the first-class baggage room and down a steep metal staircase that led to the hold. All around him were crates and trunks and bags neatly stacked on shelves and lined up on the floor. It took him a minute to figure out that everything was arranged in alphabetical order, by the owners' names, and a few minutes to find the B's. And there it was, in plain wooden crates, stamped with the words, Mr. David Burroughs, New York City, contents fragile. It's a little backwards, it's okay. George smiled to himself. This was going to be easy. He took out his knife and started to pry off the lid. He worked carefully, prying each nail loose so he'd be able to close the crate tight again when he was finished. He'd made it halfway around when he heard a strange sound. The hair on his arms prickled. It was the same feeling he'd had the night of the panther, that someone or something was watching him. George stared at the crate, his heart pounding. And before he could even take a breath, something leaped out of the shadows and pushed him to the ground. George looked up, half expecting to see a mummy rising out of the crate, her arms reaching from George's throat. What he saw was almost horrifying. It was a man with glittering blue eyes and a scar running down the side of his face. He grabbed George's knife out of his hand. The man was small, but very strong. "I'll take this," he said, admiring it. Then he looked George up and down. "So," the man said, "trying to fill your pockets with some first-class loot?" George realized he must be a robber. George had caught him in the act. No, The man pointed to George's boots. "Which trunk did you steal those from? Cost more than a third-class ticket, I'd say." George took his head. "I got them in London," he said, and too late realized he'd made a mistake. "Ah, a prince from first class," the man said with a hearty laugh. "Just down here for a little thrill. What's your name?" "George," said George softly. "Prince George," the man said, bowing in a joking way. I pity those boots wouldn't fit me," he said, standing up. "But you do have something I'd like, your key. Always wanted to see one of those first-class cabins." There was no way George could let this man up to the suite. He'd jump overboard before he let him near Aunt Daisy and Phoebe. "There's a mummy down here," he blurted out. "It's worth millions. It's in that crate." The man raised an eyebrow. George kept talking. "I thought I could sneak it off the ship and sell it in New York," George lied. "My father's business is bad. I thought if I could sell it." The man looked at the crate. "I think the way you think," he said. He waved the knife at George and told him not to move, and then he quickly worked the knife around the lid. Obviously, he'd done this many times before. He lifted the lid off the crate, but before either of them could look inside, there was a tremendous rumbling noise, and the entire hold began to shake so hard that George almost fell. The shaking got stronger and stronger. The noise got louder and louder, the thunder exploding all around them. A trunk tumbled off the shelf and hit the scar-faced man on the head. The knife clattered to the floor, but George didn't try to get it. Here was his chance to escape. He spun around, ran up the stairs, and darted out of the door. And that's the end of chapter 7.